How's it going everyone, Roslyn here. So today I'm going to conclude my series covering the different routes and their characters with a video on how you can take infinite turns with each route. Now it isn't entirely necessary to do this. I have beaten the game on the Abyss difficulty with enemy level scaling plus 100 without using any of these methods. That being said, it can be very fun to completely break games, and if you do find yourself in a tough situation against a difficult boss or something, knowing how to do this could help you get out of it and turn a death into a win. But before we go over how each route takes infinite turns, I do want to mention the old methods used in past games and explain why they either no longer work or are inefficient and not worth using. So let's go ahead and start there. The first main method used in past titles was to abuse Chronoburst. Casting Chronoburst would immediately provide the casting character with 2 extra turns in the turn order. The idea would be that you would cast Chronoburst, use the first turn granted to you to attack the enemy, and then use the second turn to cast Chronoburst again. However, with Trails into Reverie, a character can no longer cast Chronoburst on a turn provided by Chronoburst. If you do cast Chronoburst and then try to use it again on either of the 2 turns that it gave you, you will see that Chronoburst will be grayed out on your spell list. Another popular option for taking infinite turns before was to stack speed quartz and accessories on a fast character to make them as fast as possible, and then use attacks or arts that naturally have a low delay to reach a 0 delay. Unfortunately with Reverie, developers issued a patch for the Japanese version of the game, the very version that the West got, that makes it so that a character can no longer reach 1 delay through either speed or delay reducing quartz. No matter what you do, 1 delay is the lowest possible outcome now. For lower difficulties, this still results in basically taking infinite turns, but on the higher difficulties, enemy speed values will be high enough that even with 1 delay, they will start to get turns. And then finally, another popular method for taking infinite turns was to use Gaius' S-Craft, which has the absolute delay mechanic. Essentially, you would stack Gaius with quartz that gave him a bunch of delay, and then hit enemies with his S-Craft to guarantee that the delay actually hit. This is another method that does technically work in most cases, but again at higher difficulties, the speed values of enemies will be so high that getting the 100 CP on Gaius before they get another turn to use his S-Craft again becomes extremely difficult, if not impossible, especially on the Abyss difficulty. Then there is the fact that this method does require a lot of party setup in order to actually get Gaius the 100 CP required to actually use his S-Craft again before the enemy takes another turn, and then also the fact that there's just a much better option on the same route. Oh, and did I mention that in Reverie, Gaius' absolute delay is not actually so absolute anymore. Reverie actually introduced enemies that are completely immune to delay, even Gaius' absolute delay. So, how do you go about taking infinite turns then? Well, for Lloyd and Renne's route, it's actually very simple, so let's start there first. If you paid close attention to what I said about Chronoburst, a character can no longer cast Chronoburst on a turn provided by Chronoburst, then you may have picked up on what we actually need to do, and what that is to find a way to get a turn that hasn't been provided by Chronoburst. And luckily there is a way to do this: self-buffs. Usually when a character uses their self-buff, they are subject to normal delay, meaning they get the buff and then have to wait until their turn comes back around in order to actually act again. However, a handful of characters are different. There are a select few characters who, upon using their self-buff, get to act again immediately. Those characters include Lloyd, Renne, Kurt, Crow, and then the final post-game character. However, neither Renne nor the post-game character actually work for this method. This is because while they do get to act again immediately after using their self-buff, they can't actually recast those self-buffs again for a set number of turns. Basically, they can't use them until the buff actually wears off. And the ability to recast these buffs is essential for this method. As for Crow, his self-buff costs 100 CP, which is just way too expensive, as that 100 CP would need to be recovered in 3 turns, eliminating him as well, which leaves us with Lloyd and Kurt, who are conveniently spread between Lloyd and Renne's routes. So how exactly does the method work? Well, start by casting Chronoburst with either Lloyd or Kurt to get your 2 extra turns. On the first of those turns, go ahead and do an action you want with them, such as attack. Then on the second turn, use their self-buff, which, due to the unique properties of their buffs, will immediately give them another turn to act again, a turn which, critically, was not provided to you by Chronoburst, meaning you can now use it again. So the loop would be Chronoburst, attack, self-buff, Chronoburst, attack, self-buff, and so on. To sustain this loop indefinitely, you need to solve 2 problems. The first is CP and the second is EP. CP is easily solved by equipping enough CP per turn to use their self-buff every 3 turns, so 10 for Kurt and roughly 14 for Lloyd. For EP, equip them with either the Carib or Dunamis Master Quartz, both of which will restore the user's EP based on the damage they deal with normal attacks and crafts. You can even double up on the effect by equipping both of them if necessary. Alright, so that covers Lloyd and Renne's route, but what about C's route? Well, given that C's route doesn't have a character with a self buff that lets them act again immediately, we need to get a bit more creative. You see, the restriction on Chrono Burst, the one where you can't cast Chrono Burst again on a turn provided by Chrono Burst, well, it actually only applies to the character who cast Chrono Burst. If you could somehow get a character who didn't cast Chrono Burst to act on a turn provided by Chrono Burst, they would actually be able to cast Chrono Burst themselves. I wonder how many times I'm actually going to say Chrono Burst in this video. Anyways, luckily for us, Falcom has provided an easy way to do this. To demonstrate, let's use Renne and Duvali. Renne is an excellent option for this method as her self buff restores her EP and 1 BP. So start by having Renne cast Chrono Burst. Then on her first Chrono Burst turn, either attack or use her self buff if she needs to recover EP. On her second Chrono Burst turn, swap her out for Duvali, who should be in reserve, and then immediately cast Chrono Burst with Duvali. Now on Duvali's first Chrono Burst turn, have her attack. And then on her second Chrono Burst turn, swap her back out with Renne, who should be in reserve, and repeat the process ad nauseum. For this method, you can use the previously mentioned Master Quartz on Duvali or whoever else you choose to bring in, plus Renne's self buff to maintain your EP. CP per turn is only kind of needed for this method, and really only on Renne, but you can also ignore it by equipping her with Carib or Dunamis as well. And that's it. Now you know how you can take infinite turns on all 3 routes and trails into Reverie. If you found this video helpful and informative, please be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Also, if you have any questions about this video, Trails into Reverie, or any other game that I cover, feel free to hit me up over on Twitch at twitch.tv/RoslinGaming or my Discord server, both of which are linked in the video description below. Until next time, take care.